Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome back to the channel, and I'm going to do a quick book review this evening of a brilliant book that I've just finished reading. Wanted to do the video on it before the book had a chance to fade in my mind. Here it is. It is Cowboy Song, the authorised biography of Phil Lynott by Graeme Thompson. Graeme Thompson is a brilliant writer. I've read two of his other previous books. He did a great one on George Harrison, and his name escapes me for the moment, and he did a previous one on Elvis Costello, which I've also read. Both good. The George Harrison one is brilliant, actually. I think it's called Behind the Locked Door. He's done a book on Kate Bush as well, which I haven't read. Graeme is a really great writer. He's one of the best music writers around. When I did my squeeze book a few years ago, he was kind enough to give me some bits of advice here and there. I don't know Graeme personally. He's not a friend or anything, and you know, I'm not his press agent or anything, but he's a great writer. He's very incisive. He's got a great style, and he's got a great deal of insight into music and musicians, a great deal of empathy. One of the great things about this book is just the sheer amount of empathy he clearly has for this amazing character of Phil Lynott, who of course was the guy behind the great Irish band Thin Lizzy. Here he is. He was a big fan of Jimi Hendrix, and I think he closely modelled himself on Jimmy. I've been a fan of Thin Lizzy and Phil for many years. His performance on the Jeff Wayne's musical version of War of the Worlds was really the first thing that I really got into as a kid. Such a great performance in that, although I don't think Graeme Thompson is too impressed by that in the book. He doesn't cite it as one of Phil's great career highlights or anything, but that was certainly my entry point to him. Also the album Jailbreak, which was a really big album when I was a kid. I remember kids bringing this into school, and it's a record that meant a lot to me in my student days. I think I will save that for another video, but just a great iconic rock album really. And Thin Lizzy had a string of really brilliant records through the years. One thing I never really fully appreciated until I read this book actually was the difference between Thin Lizzy Mark 1 and Thin Lizzy Mark 2. They really were two different bands, you know, which I sort of knew that, but I didn't quite appreciate quite how different they were. And I think in Phil's mind they were almost two different projects. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So I didn't know too much about Phil Lynott's life. I knew obviously that he'd grown up in Dublin, and but I didn't know too much about his parentage. Really fascinating story. He was born in the West Midlands in the UK. His mother was Irish, but she'd run away to England essentially. I think Phil was born in West Bromwich, but Phil, I think his mother had lived in Liverpool, and then she'd moved to the Midlands. Phil's father was from, let me get this right now, he was called Cecil Joseph Paris, and he was from British Guiana, so he was Afro-Guianan, so he came from South America, but he was of African heritage. So you know, Phil had this very interesting mixed heritage thing going on. He was sent to live with his grandmother in Dublin when he was growing up because his mother Philomena couldn't really cope with him. He was a very free-spirited guy, really. You know, he was in bands by the time he was 14, and he was very keen on living the high life. A very popular, very charismatic young man. And one thing I didn't know about him actually was that he wasn't really a bass player originally. He started out just as a singer, playing around the clubs of Dublin, and it was only a bit later on that he got into playing the bass. I think he was taught by a guy from Skid Row, I think. But the original version of Thin Lizzy, or Tin Lizzy as they were known originally, came together in Dublin, and it was Phil along with the guitarist Eric Bell and the drummer Brian Downey, who went on to stay with the band all the way through their career actually. This is not the first album they did, this is I think the third album, Vagabonds of the Western World. But it's really interesting because, you know, later on Thin Lizzy became this hard rock band, edging into heavy metal really, but that wasn't necessarily what Phil's roots were. Phil was very interested in Irish mythology and folk music, and he had a real affinity for soul music as well, and the first version of Thin Lizzy helped him tap into all those styles really. And there's some really great writing in Graeme's book as he kind of delves into Phil's musical heritage. He was a big fan of Irish folklore. He was quite a well-read man. He was a poet, of course. Later on, he published at least 2 volumes of poetry, but he was really also into pop culture as well. He was massively into Marvel Comics. He was really into cinema as well. But he kind of rolled it all up into this very charismatic kind of musical style. Just wanted to read you just a couple of bits from the book, which really seem to sum up the way that Graeme Thompson just has this great affinity for the people he's writing about. This is just from the introduction. That it took a black, illegitimate, English-born, Irish Guyanese man to roll back the frontier is rather wonderful, even if Lynott regarded himself as an Irishman, first, last and always. No matter how Irish he felt or sounded, Lynott appeared to be the precise opposite. The distance between the seeming and the being is part of his story. Really beautiful writing, and stuff about Thin Lizzy. They became masters of the live ritual. For 5 years in the second half of the 70s, Lynott was the quintessential rock and roll frontman. He controlled and coaxed and electrified crowds to the extent that he became synonymous with the image on the front of their classic concert album Live and Dangerous, a Dionysian study in leather trousers, studded wristband, clenched fist and gypsy earring. Had he never written a single song, his voice alone would have marked him out. It's not really a rock voice at all. The wood smoke timbre, the high wire sense of timing, and offbeat phrasing positioned Lynott closer to folk and jazz. He was a crooner seduced by high voltage and heavy wattage, but the mournful grain was always an essential part of his appeal. Great writing. The story is a tragic story. Thin Lizzy did have a bit of a struggle on their hands. The first incarnation of the band broke up essentially when Eric Bell just suffered a bit of an onstage breakdown really. All the pressures of touring, all the pressures of travelling. And there was a brilliant quote from Phil actually, because Phil reconstituted Thin Lizzy as with the classic twin guitars. He got in Scott Gorham, who was an American guitarist, and a Scottish guitarist called Brian Robertson, and they were the original twin guitar of Thin Lizzy. I mean, the way Phil Lynott tells the story, his reasoning for that was he was so pissed off at the way Eric Bell had just gone into meltdown and left the band. He'd also had problems with Gary Moore as well in that original incarnation of Thin Lizzy. Gary Moore, the famous Irish guitarist, he'd done a bit of ping-ponging, leaving the band in the lurch and stuff. But there's a quote here from one of Phil's friends. I remember saying to Philip when Brian Robertson and Scott Gorham joined, "What's with the 2 guitars?" And Philip said, "The next time one of those cunts walks out, there will be another one there. I'm not going to be caught out again." Those were his exact words. Fascinating stuff. It was really a strategic thing on his part, wanting to get 2 guitarists in, so if one of them left him in the lurch, there'd be another one. But Thin Lizzy got some bad audience responses early on when they toured, supporting other bands. Phil hadn't really got his chops together yet, but he perfected this sort of heavy machismo leather kind of thing, and the songs became beefier and a bit more raucous, I suppose. And then you get into that sort of, the real great second phase of Thin Lizzy's career with Jailbreak, which was their big hit album actually. Another thing I didn't know, which I learned from this book, is that when they recorded the song Whiskey in the Jar, which was the original Thin Lizzy, did that, and that was their first hit single, and they really didn't like it at all. It was an Irish folk song, and they decided to record it, and it became a big hit, but Phil really wanted to distance himself from it. The record company wanted him to carry on making records in that vein, kind of rocked up versions of Irish folk songs, but Phil did not want to go down that route. This was their big breakthrough album, and again, Graeme Thompson, he just writes so wonderfully about Phil's ability to tell stories in song. There's a fantastic passage where he writes about The Boys Are Back in Town. He says, "This was absolutely the atmosphere that Thin Lizzy cultivated in the latter half of the 1970s, a volatile mix of fantasy and fact, the legend which describes a band and crew sharing the bond of family and closing ranks as an army. There was no hierarchy. Hotel rooms were open to all, invitations were extended wholesale, and everyone did everything together, drinking, drugging, fucking, and especially fighting." And then he says, "What elevates The Boys Are Back in Town to art is Lynott's understanding that the greatest, most enduring legends aren't created in the doing, but in the retelling. In urging his audience to remember that time down at Johnny's place and that chick that used to dance a lot, he not only makes it a communal experience, he embellishes and layers, heightening their exploits to the realm of folklore." Just brilliant writing, absolutely love it. This is the second album made with the second incarnation. You can see Scott Gorham here next to Phil, and then the two Brians looking all kind of mean and moody. And then after Jailbreak, of course, you had Johnny the Fox, which just is another great album. It's got some great stuff on it. You've got Don't Believe a Word was the big hit single from that one. The Tony Visconti team up, or the first Visconti team up, Bad Reputation, which featured just a three-man lineup of Lizzy on the front. This was the era where Brian Robertson was having some problems. He'd injured his hand on stage and he'd been missing gigs and, various things going on. The four-piece are pictured on the back, but they were starting to unravel, but still a very fine album with a classic Visconti production. The great song Southbound, Dancing in the Moonlight, which featured, apparently I didn't know this, featured this the saxophone player from Supertramp. I learnt that from the book, but a great album and possibly their high watermark, although this album has certain fans too. This was a bit of a new lineup. You had Gary Moore coming in for this one, and then Thin Lizzy did sort of go into decline, really. You had a sequence of albums later on where the guitarists were chopping and changing all the time. You had Snowy White, you had Midge-Ure, you had John Sykes, who later went on to be in Whitesnake. This is Renegade, the second to last album. I enjoy all their records, really. I know they went very heavy later on. Graeme Thompson, I don't think, has a great deal of time for those later albums. I think he sees Thin Lizzy as really peaking around about the time of Bad Reputation, and of course the tragic story of Phil's downfall was something that I hadn't properly appreciated. I know that he'd gone into decline and had suffered alcohol problems and drug problems, but I didn't realise quite how serious it was. And by this point he'd had a family. He married Leslie Crowther's daughter, which is not something that I knew before. Leslie Crowther was a game show host and a children's TV presenter in the UK, but he'd had a couple of daughters, but the marriage had fallen apart, and he was always into his high living. And it's such a tragic story because the early chapters where Phil is feeling his oats, really, and coming into his own in Dublin, a very bohemian scene in his early years, staying up all night, just having a great time, and just an incredibly sociable character and somebody who was always just in the thick of it, and then later on he just really he got into heroin and alcohol and cocaine, and various things happened, and he died far too soon, and just a really tragic story, really. So not the happiest of endings, but it was still an uplifting book in a way. It was enjoyable to spend time with him on his journey. Not a faultless character, could be controlling, could be quite intimidating, and he had his personal problems, and the drug problems were definitely there. But I just thought it was a really great book, and Graeme never disappoints. So I can highly recommend it. One thing I didn't mention actually is that it's written in cooperation with Phil's family. So I think he talked to his mother and his ex-wife and various other people. So it's nice to get an insider view on these things rather than just a journalistic account, I suppose. But very well written. Great story, tragic story, but it sent me back to the records again, which is always a sign of a good music biography. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Cowboy Song, the authorised biography of Phil Lynott by Graeme Thompson, and it's published by Constable. So there we go. I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye for now.